We begin with news today that the federal government and Alberta seem to be moving closer to a deal that could include the possibility of a BC oil pipeline.
I'm told by a senior government official that, of course, the number one demand of Alberta all along has been a new oil pipeline to northwest British Columbia. I'm told Carney is open to the idea of actually moving forward on this project, and there could be some language in that MOU that actually suggests there's a path forward, that they could maybe lay out how they could get to construction on this pipeline.
Canada just took a step that rewrites its entire energy future. With new C5 nation-building powers, Ottawa is now prepared to grant tanker exemptions on the North Coast, a move that would have been politically unthinkable under Justin Trudeau. And with that single decision, Canada has opened the door for a brand new Alberta to Pacific pipeline that could send Canadian oil directly to Asia, bypassing the United States for the first time in modern history. What we're witnessing is Canada breaking free of old taboos and acting like the energy superpower it has always claimed to be.
Yeah, we're learning that Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith are moving closer to a deal, a grand bargain, if you will, on the province's energy sector. The deal could be in hand in a matter of days, frankly. Both sides are feeling quite positive about where things are at this point in time. They want to have an MOU specifically on what it means for the oil patch and what it can do, what the feds can do to help maybe expand oil exports.
Over the past several days, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith have moved unexpectedly close to a memorandum of understanding that could reshape Canada's energy map. The two governments are finalizing a framework that would allow construction of a new pipeline toward the northwest coast of British Columbia, something that has been blocked for years. The breakthrough comes from a broader bargain. Ottawa is willing to consider exemptions to the tanker ban that has locked the North Coast since 2019. In exchange, Alberta is being asked to commit to long-term industrial carbon pricing and support for carbon capture infrastructure. This is not a single policy shift, but an entire recalibration of the federal-provincial relationship. For the first time in more than a decade, Alberta and Ottawa are moving in the same direction, and both sides appear confident they are within reach of a deal. British Columbia remains the major obstacle. Its government has signaled deep concerns, and Indigenous consultation will be extensive. Several Liberal MPs from coastal ridings have voiced hesitation as well. But the fact remains, Ottawa is now willing to pursue a Pacific corridor, something that federal politics had long treated as off-limits. The tanker ban was once treated as untouchable, a permanent wall between Alberta's landlocked oil and the world's fastest-growing energy markets. Under Trudeau, it was more than a policy. It was a political identity. But Mark Carney is governing with a different vision. Instead of clinging to symbolic gestures, he is leaning on C5, the new nation-building legislation that gives Ottawa authority to advance projects of strategic national significance. Exempting tankers under C5 isn't a rejection of environmental values, it's a recognition that a mature country can protect its coastlines while still building the infrastructure needed to sustain a modern economy. Canada is not abandoning environmental commitments, it is abandoning paralysis. That is a crucial difference, and a sign that Canada is finally learning how to balance energy security with climate ambition. The possibility of a Pacific pipeline is transformative because it gives Canada something it has never had: direct access to Asia without going through the United States. For decades, Washington has benefited from a near monopoly on Canadian heavy crude. U.S. refineries are literally built for it. Even now, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, almost 70% of America's imported crude comes from Canada. That dependency has given the U.S. enormous leverage that Donald Trump has tried to weaponize through tariffs, threats, and political pressure. A pipeline to the Pacific would break that reliance. It would open the Asian market, one that is expanding far faster than America's, and give Canada bargaining power it has never enjoyed. The mere possibility already shifts the balance. It signals to global investors that Canada is no longer content to be a captive supplier to a single customer. Perhaps the most surprising development is the tone from Alberta. After years of antagonism under the Trudeau government, Danielle Smith now describes the relationship with Ottawa as remarkably aligned. Her government believes Carney understands the urgency of unlocking Alberta's resources and the political pressures of Western alienation. That alignment is no small feat. It shows that Carney is not governing as an ideologue, but as a deal-maker, someone willing to negotiate, adapt, and deliver results that work for both energy and climate policy. This collaboration suggests a new model of federalism, one where Ottawa doesn't dictate from above and provinces don't retreat into isolation. Instead, both recognize that Canada needs national-scale infrastructure if it wants national-scale prosperity. British Columbia remains the most unpredictable part of this story. Its government is deeply protective of the North Coast, and its political base has long opposed tanker activity. Many Indigenous nations in the region also remain skeptical. Their voice will be essential legally and ethically. But even here, the political landscape is shifting. Under C5, Ottawa is asserting that national interest doesn't have to come at the expense of local protection. A case-by-case exemption model forces a conversation rooted not in ideology but in practicality. BC may still resist, but the discussion has moved beyond a simple yes or no. That alone is a dramatic departure from the past decade. This is the part Washington didn't expect. A Canada with two export corridors, one south, one west, is a Canada that cannot be pressured by tariffs or political theatrics. Trump's strategy of treating Canada as an economic junior partner becomes far less effective if Canada has alternative markets. For years, American officials assumed Canada had no choice but to play by U.S. rules. A Pacific route proves otherwise. The geopolitical implications are enormous. If Canada can export directly to Japan, South Korea, India, or other Asian consumers, it becomes a global player rather than a continental supplier, and the U.S. loses one of its most reliable pressure points. The bigger picture is not about one pipeline or one exemption. It's about a country demonstrating that it understands its own power. Canada is acting with a level of strategic maturity that has been absent from its energy policy for years. It is showing investors that it is ready to build. It is showing allies that it is ready to compete. And it is showing the United States that friendship does not require one-sided dependence. This is the beginning of a new era in Canadian energy, one defined by confidence rather than caution. Canada has crossed a psychological threshold. By opening the door to tanker exemptions and entertaining a Pacific pipeline, the Carney government has moved the country into a new strategic position. Canada is no longer frozen by its own taboos. It is no longer trapped by a single export route. It is no longer content to let other nations, even the United States, define its limitations. The question now is whether Canada will seize this moment fully or retreat into old habits. The next decisions will determine whether this becomes a turning point or a missed opportunity. But one thing is certain: Washington is paying attention, and so is the rest of the world.
On Friday, Chinese President Xi Jinping held back-to-back meetings with the Prime Ministers of Canada and Japan, signaling Beijing's intent to ease recent diplomatic tensions with both nations. At the meeting, Xi extended an invitation to Carney to visit China, describing it as an opportunity to continue dialogue and explore areas of mutual benefit. The Canadian leader welcomed the offer, saying it represented a chance to continue the dialogue in a constructive way.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has just achieved a quiet but remarkable diplomatic breakthrough at the 2025 APEC summit in Gyeongju, South Korea. The gathering of world leaders was meant to discuss trade recovery and supply chain resilience, yet the real headline emerged from two back-to-back meetings: Xi Jinping's talks with Carney and Japan's Sanae Takaichi. While Donald Trump left the summit early after declaring his America First agenda fulfilled, Beijing stayed and recalibrated. Xi's calm tone stood in sharp contrast to months of tariff friction and tense diplomacy. For Canada, the moment was both symbolic and strategic, proof that a nation long overshadowed by its U.S. neighbor could carve its own path in Asia's reshaping order. Mark Carney arrived at APEC with one objective: rebuild Canada's economic flexibility. After a year of industrial losses tied to U.S. trade disputes, Ottawa needed new partners and new momentum. The meeting with Xi Jinping, though brief, validated Carney's wider Asia strategy, working with South Korea, ASEAN, and Australia to broaden Canada's network before the 2026 USMCA review. At the Jeonju session, Canada's presence stood out. It was no longer a secondary participant following Washington's lead, but a country pursuing its own balance. Diplomatic officials confirmed that discussions touched on trade coordination, clean energy cooperation, and reopening ministerial channels frozen since 2018. No headline deal emerged, yet the tone mattered: measured, respectful, and open to rebuilding trust. For Carney, tone itself was progress, the first sign that dialogue could replace defensive rhetoric. China's outreach was deliberate. After a year of slowing exports and capital outflows, Beijing began stabilizing relations with mid-sized economies. Engaging Canada helps diversify partnerships within the G7 and demonstrates to investors that China can still manage diplomacy with Western nations. It also acknowledges the limits of confrontation. Officials in Beijing framed this shift as pragmatic recovery. Rather than competing for dominance, China is courting predictability. For Canada, that shift opens practical lanes: cooperation in food safety, clean technology, and mineral supply chains that both sides need. For China, it restores a measure of credibility within APEC after years of disputes over detained citizens and export restrictions. The gesture is small, but in Asian diplomacy, small gestures often start bigger realignments. Xi's second meeting, with Japan's Sanae Takaichi, followed the same tone: cordial, brief, but deliberate. It showed Beijing testing a selective détente across the region. Japan, though closely aligned with U.S. security policy, depends heavily on stable trade with China. Both leaders discussed maritime cooperation and managing long-standing disputes in the East China Sea. Together, the two meetings reshaped the narrative of APEC 2025. They marked the first synchronized attempt by China, Canada, and Japan to moderate rivalry instead of escalate it. For Carney, this multipolar atmosphere creates opportunity. As the world splits between tariff walls and security blocs, Canada positions itself as the pragmatic bridge, small enough to talk to everyone, credible enough to be heard. By the summit's end, no joint statement changed the rules of global trade. Yet something more valuable occurred: a reset in tone and trust. The APEC images of Carney and Xi shaking hands captured a turning point for Canada's foreign policy, from a defensive stance to active diplomacy. Carney's approach shows that influence is not measured only by tariffs or GDP, but by composure and persistence. Amid U.S. volatility and Chinese recalibration, Canada found room to maneuver. If this cautious engagement continues, it could lay the groundwork for new trade corridors across Asia, defined not by ideology, but by stability. The Gyeongju summit may fade from headlines, yet its meaning endures. In a world of escalating economic confrontation, Canada quietly proved that dialogue still works, and that sometimes diplomacy's smallest gestures can mark the biggest shift.
Drill, baby, drill.
With sour trade relations south of the border, some see it as our drill, baby, drill moment, much to the chagrin of others.
We live in the greatest country in the entire world, bar none. We live in the greatest sub-sovereign nation in the world, bar none. And we could be the richest, most powerful, most secure jurisdiction anywhere in the entire world.
The sound of drilling is echoing across Nova Scotia's countryside. What began as a quiet geological project has turned into something far larger. In this small Atlantic province, officials are calling it our drill baby drill moment. It's not just about rocks or minerals anymore, it's about power.
For decades, Canada's resource-rich provinces watched as global markets and foreign governments shaped their economic fate, but now Nova Scotia has decided to change that. Its message is simple. If the world wants critical minerals, Canada will be the one to supply them, and on its own terms. This is the story of how one province became the front line of Canada's new economic independence at a time when its southern neighbor is tightening every screw of its trade agenda. The turning point came quietly but decisively. After years of slow development and environmental caution, Nova Scotia's government announced a sweeping reversal in 2025. It lifted long-standing bans on uranium exploration, removed moratorium on natural gas fracking, and shortened the permit process for mineral exploration. The move shocked even seasoned observers, but it was born from a realization. Canada's economy could no longer rely on imported minerals or the uncertain goodwill of its allies. As the United States tightened its grip on North American supply chains, and as China restricted the export of rare earths, the world entered a scramble for materials that power everything from batteries to fighter jets. In this race, Canada saw both a threat and an opportunity. For Nova Scotia, the response was simple. Rather than waiting for foreign partners to dictate terms, it would start digging and take control of its own future. The deeper motivation was about sovereignty. The provincial government framed the move as part of a broader national awakening, a recognition that energy security and industrial stability begin with control over raw materials. Federal policymakers in Ottawa have repeatedly cited Nova Scotia as a model for strategic autonomy, noting that the province's reforms mirror Canada's new partnerships with Japan and the European Union on battery minerals. By moving first, Nova Scotia positioned itself not as a follower of federal directives, but as the engine of a new national resource strategy, one that blends economic survival with political assertion.
In the rural town of Brazil Lake, where granite hills meet dense forests, the government's new policy took on real meaning. A prospector had been waiting for years to drill for lithium, one of the most valuable minerals of the modern age. When negotiations with a private landowner collapsed, the province stepped in and invoked a rarely used law to force access to the site. It was a move that divided the province. For some, it was heavy-handed. For others, it was leadership. By 2022, mineral claims in Nova Scotia had already tripled to 27,000. Roughly half of those were lithium-related. The International Energy Agency projected that global lithium demand would increase 40-fold by 2040. That forecast turned what was once a niche mineral into a strategic gold mine. Veteran prospectors estimate that even a small lithium mine could create jobs worth about $100,000 per year for local communities, with full-scale projects employing around 200 workers. The message from Halifax was clear. Nova Scotia would not sit on its resources while others decided their fate. It was no longer just economic policy, it was an act of defiance. But this defiance also exposed deep social divides. Many residents, including eighth-generation landowners and Indigenous communities, feared being excluded from decisions that could reshape their environment for decades. The provincial government promised consultation, but skepticism remained high. To its supporters, this was the price of progress, a necessary trade-off to compete in a world dominated by industrial giants. To its critics, it symbolized the erosion of local rights under the weight of global demand. Either way, the policy made one thing clear. Nova Scotia was willing to cross political and social lines to claim its share of the resource future.
To understand the weight of this decision, you have to look south. In 2025, the United States, under President Donald Trump's second term, doubled down on its America First trade agenda. Washington imposed tariffs ranging from 10 to 100% on imports, including metals, vehicles, and industrial components. The intention was to strengthen American industry. The result was very different. Canada, long treated as a predictable supplier, began to rewire its strategy. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government used the tension to accelerate a broader industrial plan. Ottawa and the provinces turned toward Europe and Asia, negotiating sectoral resource agreements to diversify away from U.S. dependence.
In that context, Nova Scotia's push for critical mineral development was not an isolated act. It was part of a nationwide movement to secure sovereignty over natural resources, from lithium to cobalt to uranium and rare earth elements. Ironically, Washington's attempt to dominate the North American supply chain pushed its closest ally to build one of its own. The trade war that was meant to secure America's advantage ended up awakening a new competitor right next door. Nova Scotia's mineral rush is still in its early days, but it already carries enormous symbolic weight. It represents a new chapter in Canada's economic identity, one defined by self-reliance, resource control, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. The province's gamble is not without risks. Environmental concerns are real, Indigenous leaders warn that they have not been properly consulted, and the question of how far governments can go in forcing exploration on private land remains unsettled. Yet one fact is undeniable. Canada is no longer waiting for approval. From lithium mines to uranium fields, the country is building a resource firewall that could redefine its relationship with the United States. The North American trade conflict has moved underground, quite literally, and as drills pierce the bedrock of Nova Scotia, they are uncovering not just minerals, but a deeper shift in the balance of power across the continent.
And earlier this week, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a new economic and security agreement with Mexico. And just yesterday, Canada's finance minister held talks in Denmark with European Union officials. Now, all of this comes as Canada looks to diversify its trade portfolio in the face of Trump's tariffs.
When Washington raised tariffs this year, Canada faced a stark choice: stay quiet and accept the pressure, or reach out to new partners. Ottawa chose the second path. Within days, Prime Minister Mark Carney signed a new economic and security agreement with Mexico, and Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne traveled to Europe for high-level talks with the European Union. These steps were not symbolic gestures. They were clear signals that Canada will not stand alone, no matter how much pressure comes from the White House. What was supposed to be a moment of weakness has turned into a moment of action. Trump's tariff strategy was designed to corner Canada, to make the country feel dependent on access to the U.S. market. Instead, it has become the trigger for Canada to strengthen bonds with its continental neighbor and one of the world's largest economic blocs. The choice Ottawa made is now reshaping Canada's trade strategy and shifting the balance of power across North America and beyond. Trump's reciprocal tariff regime was unveiled this summer as a sweeping attempt to reset global trade. According to the White House proclamations, tariffs on cars and parts rose to 25% in March 2025 under Section 232, and a wider reciprocal framework took effect on September 1. The intention was clear. By raising duties, the administration hoped partners like Canada would concede quickly. Yet the opposite is unfolding. Ottawa is responding not with retreat, but with acceleration. Instead of waiting for relief from Washington, Canada is building a trade firewall of its own. Tariffs that were designed to weaken Canadian industries are forcing Ottawa to search for stability elsewhere. Each new duty on steel or aluminum, each added barrier on canola or copper is acting as a trigger for diversification. Rather than standing isolated, Canada is turning outward, binding itself more closely with neighbors and allies who are eager for dependable partners. This is how a tariff policy meant to dominate has ended up opening doors for Canada abroad. The first door opened in Mexico City. In mid-September, Carney and President Claudia Sheinbaum announced a strategic partnership covering agriculture, infrastructure, energy, and security. For Canadian canola farmers cut off from China's $5 billion market, Mexico's growing biofuel sector now offers a badly needed outlet. For Canada's energy producers, Mexico's infrastructure expansion creates fresh demand. The agreement is short on fanfare but long on significance. It showed that Canada can still shape continental ties without bending to Washington. Only days later, Champagne landed in Europe to pursue the next step. Speaking with EU officials in Denmark, the message was about more than trade volumes. Canada already has CETA, which in its 8 years has lifted services trade by over 70% and goods trade by 65%. The new focus is what experts call CETA Plus. That means moving into strategic cooperation on energy security, critical minerals, defense, artificial intelligence, and digital trade. These are the very sectors where Canada wants to secure future growth. With Europe searching for reliable suppliers of nickel, cobalt, and clean energy inputs, Ottawa is presenting itself as a trusted partner. By expanding ties with both Mexico and the EU, Canada is weaving a network that makes tariffs from Washington less decisive.
The chain of events is striking. Trump applied tariffs to isolate Canada. Instead, Canada responded by strengthening bonds with Mexico in Europe. The U.S. sought leverage. What it created was momentum for Ottawa to diversify. Rather than waiting for concessions, Canada is building its own strategy. The numbers tell the story. Trade with the EU has already expanded by double digits under CETA. The new partnership with Mexico targets agriculture and energy worth billions. And consultations at home are preparing Canada for the formal review of the North American Trading Pact next year. The lesson is that tariffs do not always weaken their target. In this case, they have produced resilience. Canada is not retreating, but repositioning. Trump's policy was meant to break Canada's unity, yet it has instead accelerated Canada's outreach and strengthened its global standing. What was supposed to be a trap has become a turning point. Canada is showing that it can withstand pressure, forge new ties, and emerge more secure than before.
Starting on day one of my new administration, we will end inflation and we will make America affordable again because the prices are too high.
In the campaign, the big promise by Donald Trump was that he was going to bring down prices and make America affordable again. And everything he's done is the opposite of that.
In the midst of Trump's tariff tensions, while Canada is moving to strengthen its economy and build on its national advantages, many Americans struggle with higher costs and fading confidence. At stake is the true impact of tariffs. Will they restore U.S. factory jobs, or will they weigh the economy down into recession? President Trump entered office promising to bring prices down and make life affordable. Instead, households are facing higher costs at every corner. Grocery bills show eggs up around 16%, coffee 14%, and beef 11%, according to recent consumer price reports highlighted by critics. Automobiles and hardware are also more expensive, while health insurance renewals are forecast to climb by about 20% as tariffs lift the price of imported medicines. Utility bills are rising too, in part because new renewable projects have been slowed while demand from data centers keeps climbing. The result is a squeeze that millions of families feel daily. Inflation may not be surging at double digits, but the cost of essentials continues to climb. That sets up the first test of tariff policy. Are these measures actually making life better for workers, or are they quietly taxing consumers while missing the promised revival of factory jobs? The evidence suggests that tariffs are poorly matched to the structure of today's economy. Nobel laureate Paul Krugman has emphasized that the real drag on manufacturing jobs has long been automation and productivity, not just trade. Tariffs cannot undo that shift. In fact, higher input costs encourage firms to automate faster. The auto industry shows why. North American production is deeply integrated. A single car's components may cross the US, Canada, and Mexico borders 7 or 8 times before completion. Tariffs on steel and aluminum raise costs at every step. Instead of creating new assembly jobs, firms streamline processes and cut labor needs. Moreover, tariffs often fall on inputs rather than finished goods. That squeezes domestic manufacturers who rely on global supply chains. Companies that rushed imports before tariffs took effect have now exhausted inventories. As new orders arrive, costs climb, and businesses can no longer absorb the difference. Consumers pay more, while factories see little incentive to expand hiring. The second test is growth. Tariffs work like a selective sales tax. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that recent tariff rounds add about 0.4 of a percentage point to inflation in 2025 and 2026, while reducing GDP and real income. The International Monetary Fund places the effective U.S. tariff rate this year above 17%, warning that it heightens risks of slower growth. Uncertainty makes the damage worse. Businesses cannot plan capital spending if tariff rates shift unpredictably from one month to the next. That climate discourages investment and hiring. Export industries face retaliation abroad, cutting orders and reducing utilization in factories at home. The Federal Reserve faces a dilemma: tolerate higher prices for longer or tighten policy and risk choking demand. Either path weighs on economic momentum.
Across the border, Canada is responding to the same global shocks in a different way. Prime Minister Mark Carney has launched a Build Canada agenda that fast-tracks major energy and infrastructure projects. LNG Canada has shipped its first cargo from Kitimat. Nickel output reached 190,000 tons in 2024, nearly half of U.S. imports, positioning Canada as a critical supplier for electric vehicles and chips. Offshore wind projects in Nova Scotia are set to attract tens of billions in investment and provide clean power for export to New England. The contrast is striking. In the United States, tariffs raise costs and cloud the outlook for jobs and growth. In Canada, the crisis has become a catalyst for investment and long-term capacity. Tariffs may shift trade flows, but they cannot reverse automation or restore yesterday's factory payrolls. Competitiveness now depends on cost, certainty, and the ability to build. Canada is moving forward on that front, while America struggles with the unintended consequences of tariff policy.